Hi everyone, we will be beginning shortly, just a few more seconds and we'll get started soon. Hi everyone and welcome to the discussion of Israel elections 2021 decision at last. Thank you for joining us today. We're really happy to have you. My name is Crystal Flacaro-Heaps, and I am the Program Assistant for IIP, the Israel Innovation Project at Northwestern University. I'm here to go over a few technical items before we start. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on Facebook in the next few days. And we'll also send a follow-up email so you can get the webinar in your archives. And at the end of the discussion, we will leave a few minutes for Q&A. So you can start sending your questions in throughout the webinar, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And if we can't get to them, we will try our best to answer after the fact. I will now like to introduce Elie Rekhess. He's the director of IIP, who will be interviewing our guest speaker, Anshel Pfeffer, on the upcoming Israeli elections. Elie, I now pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Crystal. Good afternoon, good evening to all our listeners, all our guests on whichever part of the globe you've been joining us. I hope you're all well, strong, safe during these fraught days. So I would like to warmly welcome you. I hear that Chicago is cold. I'm based in Tel Aviv, Anshel in Jerusalem. Allow me very briefly to introduce myself. I'm Elie Rekhess. I'm the Crown Visiting Professor in Israel Studies and also the head of IIP, the Israel Innovation Project at the Weinberg College at Northwestern. I'm also the Israel liaison with the Vice President Office for International Relations at Northwestern. This event in particular is organized by IIP. A word about IIP. It's founded in order with the aim, with the goal, with the objective of enhancing collaboration between Northwestern and Israeli institutions of higher learning, mostly with an emphasis on technological, scientific connections between these institutions of higher learning in Israel and Northwestern in the field of Israel studies. With a focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and so forth. We interpret Israel studies in a broader sense, going beyond the traditional definition of history, politics, and conflict. As I said in our last events, we had brought scientists from both parts of the ocean to discuss scientific innovation in the field of COVID-19, biomed, and so forth. But we do not restrict ourselves to the sciences only, as you can see in this present case. We are also interested in Israeli studies in general, Israeli society in general as well. So to discuss the forthcoming Israeli elections, we invited as our guest speaker today, Anshel Pfeffer. Anshel Pfeffer has been with us in the past. He's a British-born senior political correspondent for Haaretz and Israel correspondent for The Economist. He wrote also for the New York Times, the Washington Post, other venues, and has covered over the last 24 years a wide range of beats, including politics, security, issues, education, religion, international affairs as well. His latest book, guess what, is entitled Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu, published in 2018. Before we begin, I just want to make sure that I thank Crystal for her invaluable help in organizing this webinar. It wouldn't have happened without her help. So let's begin without further ado. As Israel prepares to hold its fourth elections in 2 years, many begin to ask, what's wrong with us? I should add a disclaimer also. I do not represent any political outlook or political viewpoint, though it may sound like this. I'm only the moderator. I'm only the messenger. And I want to start with some statistics, which were just recently published by the IDI, the Israel Democracy Institute, which shows the following. Israel ranked as having had more elections on average than nearly any other parliamentary democracy in the world. It's first amongst 20. Every 2.3 years, Israel has an election campaign compared to higher than any other 20 other nations, as I said, compared, for example, to 4.5 years in Ireland, for example. So there must have been something happening, some sea changes that have occurred within the Israeli political system, which leads or led to this anomaly. So let me begin with a question pertaining to the more general nature of the Israeli political system and address this to Anshel. Is it correct, Anshel, to assume that Israel now acquires what political scientists are referring to as a populistic politics? Now, what do I mean by that? Bibi no longer represents an ideology of party politics, but rather the will of the people, us versus them. We are against the left-wing controlled media, quote unquote, Supreme Court, the public administration, the corrupted elites. What we witness, again, what political scientists call the personification of politics as a universal phenomenon at the expense of the diminishing of parties. Emphasis is shifted to the centrality of the one leader. Again, a phenomenon we see in Europe, elsewhere, rather than the party, the government, the ministry. The parties hardly function. The competition is not between ideas, but between images of leaders. Is this correct, Anshel? Do we undergo a new phase in Israeli politics of this kind, sir?
Hi, Elie. Thank you for having me. I hope everybody can hear me loud and clear. Good evening from Jerusalem. I think that there were a number of, you asked basically a number of questions here, but you brought up this statistic at the beginning of the incredible number of elections Israel has had, and so much higher than other parliamentary democracies. Israel is a limited and fragile democracy, but the system, at least within the Green Line, is a parliamentary democracy. And the question really is the system broken? Is the Israeli electoral system even capable, really, of delivering a clear result? And if you'd have asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have argued yes, because Israel had 20 elections in its first 71 years, 20 Knesset elections, and each of those elections delivered a result. At the end of the election, there was a period, obviously, of coalition building, because for those who are less aware of the system, it's a multi-party system, so no party has ever won an outright majority, so every government is a coalition government based on a number of parties. But we knew more or less, if not on election night, at least within a few weeks after the coalition negotiations had worked out. We knew who the winner was. We knew who was going to form a government. We knew who would be in that, which parties would be in that government. And I think the system didn't work that badly for the first 71 years. And even as you remember, in 1984, when there was a tie between Likud and Labour, finally they reached a compromise of a national unity government where Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres, who were the two party leaders, split the prime ministerial term between them 2 years each. So we had a system which for 71 years delivered results. Now, it's true there were too many elections. The governments weren't always stable. They fell too often, and an early new election had to be held. But I think the system worked reasonably well, because what do we require from a democratic electoral parliamentary system? That it will deliver a leader, that people will, that it'll produce a parliament, and the parliament that can elect a prime minister, and that people trust the results, and that every so often also the result will change the party of leadership. For the first 29 years, Israel had a Labour government, but finally in 1977, Likud won. And ever since then, every few years, leadership passed between Likud and Labour, and we once had a centrist Kadima government. So the system worked. In the last 2 years, we've had now 4 consecutive elections. We're about to have the fourth. 3 elections failed to produce a winner. There was a stalemate each time. After 2 elections, no government was formed, and we went to another election. And after the 3rd election, almost a year ago, finally, after a long period of arguing and tussling, Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu joined in a sort of national unity government, in a similar idea of splitting the terms. That didn't work, and a few months later, the government fell, and we are where we are now. So we've now had 3 elections. We're about to have a 4th, and we didn't receive the result that we always received, in which we always had a government, like I said, not always a stable government, but we always knew who had won after the election. So we have to ask now: has the system broken down? Is the Israeli electoral system still a system capable of delivering results? And we've had 3 elections which didn't deliver a result. And you asked about the populist and the personal aspects of Israeli politics. I think the most obvious answer to that question, is the system broken, is that the system worked reasonably well until 2 years ago. And now there is a bug in the system, and that bug is the Bibi bug, Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu has personalized Israeli politics to such an extent and tried to create an atmosphere in Israel whereby any result of the election, which is not a victory for him, is a legitimate result, and therefore another election has to be held until Israelis come up with the right result, and the only right result can be Netanyahu continuing as prime minister. Then yes, we have a very populist and very personalized style now of politics, which all revolves around one man. And this is not just Netanyahu who's responsible for this. He's the main source of this dysfunction of Israeli politics. But we have to blame also the opposition parties, because not only have they failed to coalesce around a challenger to Netanyahu who can win a majority for himself. And let's remember, Benny Gantz, on paper, after the 2nd and the 3rd elections in the series, seemed to have a majority. There were more Knesset members who were willing to endorse Gantz than were willing to endorse Netanyahu. But they couldn't get together and form a party, mainly because they didn't want to cooperate with the Arab, the MKs of the Arab joint list. But that wasn't the main issue. The main issue in the end was that this was all around Netanyahu. The election had no subject, had no issue, and no agenda, no social issues, no security issues, nothing about state and religion. It was all about, is Benjamin Netanyahu suitable to be prime minister, or do we have to kick him out? And when an election revolves around one person, something is very wrong with the political system.
Anshel, excuse me for interrupting you, but is the system repairable, or is the damage is so bad that it all fell apart and we are back to square one, and that the whole system needs to be restarted? This is my question. I mean, we understand Bibi's motives, and Gantz, I agree with you, has contributed his part. But the question is, are we facing a reconfiguration of the political system to a point that it is irreparable? When you see, I'll speak about ideology in a moment. We'll discuss ideology you see, for any political system, if I may contribute my humble contribution, for a political system to succeed, you need three elements. You need leadership, you need ideology, and you need organization. Very simplistically put. Now, if two of these systems are gone and you remain with a leader, I don't want to tell you what connotation goes through my mind, but my question to you, from your political observation, is it gone? Can it be repaired? Can it be restored? What's your take?
I just add to your observation now, when you say it needs leadership, it only has half leadership, because you also need a leader of the opposition. You need to have a healthy political debate in a country. You need also a credible leader on the other side. So Israel has leadership in the sense that it has a prime minister who is certainly a leader for his own camp, but there's no leader of the opposition. So Israel only has half of these three things. But to your question, it's not repairable in the sense that there is no way to repair it and change the electoral system, because you need some kind of consensus. You need some kind of a majority in the Knesset to pass changes to the electoral system. But the electoral system is currently working for the parties, because if you're a small party in today's electoral system, you have a lot of bargaining power as a small party. And if the Knesset currently is made up of small parties, Likud, which is the largest party, isn't even a third of the Knesset. And it probably will be much less than a third after this election. So we have a Knesset which is divided into a dozen small parties. Then none of these parties have an interest in changing the system. Yes, most of them want to get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu, but the system is working for them, for their narrow interests, that they want to be able to use this little political power they have as efficiently for them as possible. And the way to do that is the current system, which gives so much power to small parties over the majority. So I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future until we return to a system like we had up until the late 1980s, where 2/3 of the Knesset were, or even 3/4 of the Knesset were two big parties. When we have that, I think that those two big parties will get together and perhaps find a way of changing the electoral system. So right now, I can't see a change to the system until somehow Netanyahu leaves, whether he leaves because finally the opposition can get together enough seats to appoint a different prime minister, or whether he leaves because of his legal issues, because of the corruption case ongoing, or whether he leaves because for his own reasons, for his health reasons. He's 71 years old. He's not a young man anymore. But right now, with all the system revolving around one man, and one man who is so good at marshalling these small parties and finding ways to build these coalitions of frustrated, angry little parties, nobody does it better than Bibi. I can't see the system changing at this point.
So you wrote a biography of Netanyahu.
It's here in the back.
So yeah. So two questions. Number one, so what you're saying is that if he fails in the elections, this wouldn't really bring the remedy. Do I read you correctly, or would it bring the remedy to the political system if he fails for whatever reason, which I personally do not see this happening? We can speak about his capabilities as a strategic politician, and I think he's in many ways he's a genius. I studied the Arab society, and what he did there, what he's doing there is really amazing. But if he's removed, or if he fails, are we salvaged? Number one. And number two, oh, okay, so why don't you take that?
I mean, nobody can answer what Israeli politics will look like on the day after Netanyahu. The post-Bibi era is a mystery because he's been now prime minister for 11 years, almost 12 years straight, and altogether almost 15 years. He's the longest serving prime minister. He's dominated Israeli politics for so long, and politics has basically been built around him for so long that the moment he's gone, this this idea or this concept of Netanyahu, which kept together Likud and kept together the right wing and kept together the opposition because everything was about him. Yes, Bibi, no Bibi. Suddenly, Israeli politics will have to be about issues again. Suddenly, we can have real parties again, and all this is all this is a mystery because we haven't had this for quite a while. So to try and predict if Israeli politics will go back to normal and what the new normal will look like is almost impossible. I think it's possible. I think there can be Israeli politics in the post-Bibi era because life goes on, and even leaders who have been in power for very long, there's a future after them. But I really think that anybody who's going to try and tell you this is what the post-Netanyahu period is going to look like, I think that they're basically fools, and it'll be very difficult for the next prime minister because the next prime minister will constantly be compared to Netanyahu, and everything that happens wrong on the next prime minister's guard, they'll say, but if Bibi was here, it wouldn't be happening. So it's going to be a period, I think, of Israel's going to have to go into sort of a somewhat like an addict who's trying to kick the habits once Netanyahu leaves. I mean, as an Israeli journalist, I'm thinking, what am I going to write about when Bibi's not going to be here?
You know what goes through my mind is if we're going through an orphanage period of time. We're going to be orphans if Bibi is going. I'm saying it cynically. But if I can ask you a question, you've studied.
I mean, I'm too young, but Israel had that feeling in 1963 after David Ben-Gurion left the prime minister job. I'm not comparing, but there was a feeling in Israel, and I wasn't around then, but I've read enough about it, of are we going to be okay without the father of the nation? And there will be Israelis on the day Netanyahu leaves who will feel, how are we going to make the country work after Bibi leaves? Because there are many Israelis who believe now that Netanyahu is the only person protecting and keeping Israel from disaster. There are, you and I may not think that, but there is a sizable group of Israelis who do feel that.
So very briefly, and because there are a lot of other questions waiting, as someone who had studied Bibi so thoroughly, what's his secret?
I think there is a number of answers to that. I'll try and.
What's his enigma?
First of all, most politicians hate elections. That's the secret. You see a politician on the campaign trail, they're smiling, their wife or their husband is standing next to them. They're all, they're in the carnival of the campaign trail. That's a show. Anybody who's actually spent time around politicians know that most politicians can't wait for the election to be over so they can actually get down to the business of governing. That's most people go into politics because they want to change things. They want to, they want their policy. They want to make policy, and they want to make decisions. They want to govern. And Netanyahu is a politician who comes alive in election. He relishes it. You see him making election speeches. He's been doing it for so long. Remember, Netanyahu joined politics in 1987 as a new member of Likud when he first ran in the Likud internal elections for the list. He's been doing this now for 34 years, and he loves it. You see him like he's like one of these race horses where you see when the race begins, you see the nostrils suddenly expand and the muscles ripple along their body. Bibi is that kind of a political animal. He loves the election, and he feels, even when there isn't an election campaign, he feels he's fighting an election campaign. He's thinking about the next campaign. He's constantly looking at polls. He's constantly fighting. He's very paranoid. So he thinks that the whole time people are waiting around the corner to grab power away from him. So he's constantly fighting for these things. And he's like a whole, if you look at a basketball or a football match and you have 5 or 11 or how many players on each side, Netanyahu is all the players at once. He's doing everything. You mentioned how he's now courting the Arab vote. Netanyahu will be thinking simultaneously about 7 or 8 different groups, and he'll be planning on every step of the campaign, and he will be in a full court press in a campaign. And most politicians, after a while, they're exhausted. We saw Benny Gantz, a newcomer to politics. He said that his first year in politics, that first campaign, he said it was the worst year of his life. For him, it was exhausting and tiring, and he had so much mud thrown at him. He just wanted to get out. And that's why, in the end, he gave up to Netanyahu in the coalition agreement. But Netanyahu never gives up. He has this incredible drive, and I don't know what the secret of his drive is at the age of 71, but he doesn't see the next election as his goal. He sees the next decade. He's thinking of how to be prime minister for another decade, not just until the next election.
But does he have a vision? Does he, I mean, other than getting away from the rope, does he have a vision? Does he, I mean, we all speak about his trial, but I mean, he's the leader. He has been the leader for so many years. And I mean, you sat face to face with him. You would expect some sort, you mentioned Ben Gurion, and I said Lehavdil. And Ben Gurion was the founding father. Can you envisage? I mean, we dedicate a lot of time to Bibi, and I want to move away from Bibi. But so my last comment: would he go down history as the, I don't know how to say it, the second in line, the third in line, fourth in line?
I think that you can't say that Netanyahu does not have a vision. It's true that right now, certainly over the past 2 years, he has been focused in a major way on getting out of his, trying to avoid the trial, and the trial's now started. He's still trying to shut it down or to try and get an immunity law. But to say that Netanyahu hasn't got a vision or hasn't got ideology is just wrong. All you have to do is read his book from 1993, A Place Among the Nations. It's a 500-page long book, and I wouldn't say it's the most well-written or stylish book I've ever read, but it's a serious book of ideology and history and diplomatic plans. Netanyahu has a vision of Israel, which is very much the Jabotinskian vision of the Iron Wall, Israel building an iron wall between it and the rest of the region, the Arab world. And behind that iron wall, Israel, it remains a very strong military country. It doesn't make any concessions to any of the Arab neighbors, certainly not the Palestinians, and it waits until the Arab world accepts it as a legitimate part of the Arab world. And I think that what we saw in the last 6 months with 4 Arab countries signing normalization agreements with Israel, we see some kind of vindication for Netanyahu's policy. Now, we may not agree that this will work in the long term. Many of us predict that the Palestinian issue will still remain and blow up in Israel's face, and it's an unjust situation where Israel controls the lives of 5 million Palestinians without political rights. So that is something which shouldn't be allowed to remain. But Netanyahu is convinced that it can remain, and ultimately the Palestinians will give up and accept some very watered down state or autonomy or enclave or something like that. And that is a vision, because he has been working on that policy for his entire career. And the things he wrote in 1993 are the things he's still doing today. Occasionally he'll make some kind of tactical shift, like in the Bar Ilan speech in 2010, when he seemed to be accepting the two-state solution. That obviously he wasn't accepting the solution, but that was a tactical concession to Barack Obama. He's long since given up on that concession. He's no longer talking about the two-state solution, and he never really meant it when he talked about it. So you can see this vision of a strong Israel, which does not make any concessions, is Netanyahu's vision, and he's sticking to it. And your additional question about, will history see him as a great leader in Ben-Gurion's mold? I think you can't say that a prime minister who has been for so long in office is an inconsequential figure historically. He will be remembered as the second most important prime minister in Israel in the first 70, 80 years of Israel's history. I don't know who we're going to have next in another 10 or 20 years, but I think by now Netanyahu symbolizes the second half of Israel's history. Ben-Gurion was the important leader of the foundation in the first half, and I think even those of us who are very critical of him have to admit he is the most significant leader of Israel in Israel's second half of existence.
I would also add to the list the labor leaders like Rabin, but this is another story. Let me move. Let's
leave. I think Netanyahu has achieved more from his perspective, and certainly from his supporters.
I agree. I mean, he's been there for such a long period of time. But let's leave Netanyahu because I look at the clock and time is running. Let me look. We mentioned Rabin. Let's move to labor, and let me quote from your article 2 or 3 days ago. And you had a very strong quote referring to the election of Merav Michaeli as the new chairman of labor. And you said the following. You congratulated her, quote unquote, saying, Merav, welcome to the worst job in Israeli politics, quote unquote. Not a very congratulatory statement. And then you explained, because no politician wants to be remembered as under whom labor didn't make it to the Knesset. I'm not sure she had a big smile on her face when she read that.
But she's aware of it. She knows that. We have to say to her credit.
We should explain perhaps to our listeners who are not familiar with what happened. Merav Michaeli was elected as the new chairperson, I should say, of Labour Party. Was not elected in a big. There weren't too many participants in the primaries. Only 36% of the primary members. But anyway, she made it, and she's the new chairperson of Labour. But you really eulogized her in a way. No, I mean, not personally. No, of course. But you eulogized the Labour Party. I mean, the Labour Party, as far as you're concerned, is gone. Okay, so what did you mean? You know what?
First of all, I actually think Labour Party has a future, and I'll explain why in a moment. But the best eulogy was written already 12 years ago by Amos Oz, the late celebrated Israeli writer, who said in an interview with Haaretz 12 years ago, Labour is ending its historic role. Now, very few political parties in the world have done what Labour have done. They founded a nation. Israel was, to a very large degree, founded by the labor movement, by Ben-Gurion's, what was then called the Workers' Party of the Land of Israel, Mapai. It was a founding party, and it led Israel for 30 years, and it built up a state. I mean, whatever people think about Israel and Israel's pluses and minuses, you can't ignore what Labour has done not just as a political party, as a state-building organization. So, that was Labour's historic role. But ever since Labour lost power for the first time in 1977, when Menachem Begin's Likud won for the first time, Labour hasn't really worked out what its role is. So in the 1990s, Labour was the party of the Oslo Accords, and it called itself the Peace Camp. But then the Second Intifada began in 2000, and the Israeli public lost confidence in the Oslo process, and it's never really began a new diplomatic process with the Palestinians. And Labour hasn't worked out what it stands for, and we see that in the results. Labour is down to its last 3 Knesset members. In most of the polls, it's not crossing the threshold. In Israel, you need a 3.25% of the vote to cross the electoral threshold and get into the Knesset. So currently, this party, which ruled the state and seemed so omnipotent for so many years, now seems to be disappearing. And this is not Merav Michaeli's fault. She's only been a Knesset member for 8 years, and she's been one of the better Knesset members. And she is certainly aware of the scale of the challenge that is facing her. It's not just an electoral challenge. The party is in disarray. It's a party which eats its leaders alive. It's had, in the last 20 years, 10 leaders. So, life expectancy for a Labour leader is not very long. And the previous leader, Amir Peretz, has been trying to use the party machinery against Merav. I mean, this is nothing. It's in no way a criticism of Merav Michaeli. She faces a huge challenge just to make sure that Labour even gets into the next Knesset. And even if they do get in the next Knesset, still the way she has, the journey she has to return Labour to anything near what it once was, and what it once was a contender for power, it's still a long journey. I spoke to Merav on Saturday, the day before the leadership election. I said to her, how long is it going to take you? She said, obviously it's going to take me a lot more than one election campaign. And she's very, very clear-eyed. She knows exactly what she's facing.
Definitely a new face and a very impressive figure in the political scenery and landscape of Israeli politics. But my question, it's not only the question of personality and leadership, it's a question of substance. It's a question of ideology. And I'm coming back to ideology here, of values, of norms. Where have all the flowers gone? What's the merchandise that they have to, you and I are coming from a background where we still remember what ideology was all about. I mean, I at least grew in a background where there were values. We were taught and we were preached that there are something that we need to fight for the nature and value of the state of Israel. What does Labour has to sell to the younger generation today? Where is the ideology?
I don't think the younger generation are really looking at Labour now, but the problem is that they don't know where to look, because the moment Labour basically gave up, and Labour gave up when Ehud Barak agreed to be part of Netanyahu's coalition back in 2009. That really was the moment where Labour ran up the white flag and said, you know what, we'll be the junior partner to Netanyahu's coalition. And I think, Ehud Barak is the last Labour prime minister, but he's also the guy who basically gave up on Labour being a contender for power. From that moment, there's no reason to look to Labour. If Labour is not willing, what is a party of power? A party of power is not necessarily the party in power. It's the party which is either in power or is leading the opposition and doing everything it can to get back into power. And Labour gave up the fight. And once Labour gave up the fight, then the question is who's going to put an alternative to the Netanyahu vision. And then we said what the Netanyahu vision is. It's a very bleak and very nationalist and very muscular vision. There has to be an alternative to that, but nobody's really giving any good idea for what the alternative is. Meretz, which is to Labour's left, seems a more ideological party, but they're also sort of like stuck in their Tel Aviv bubble. Apologies, I know you live in Tel Aviv, but it's a bubble. Most Israelis don't feel that Tel Aviv represents them, and Meretz is sort of a Tel Aviv party. And Yair Lapid, sort of
the state of Tel Aviv, the state of Tel Aviv.
Well, we used to call it Gush Dance. And Yair Lapid with his sort of wishy-washy centrist, not really clear ideas, trying not to offend too many people, trying to get people from left and right to vote for him. You're right, there is no clear ideological ground. And I think that mainly is because Labour gave up on being an alternative. And I think that's one thing. And you say you don't want to talk about personality, but Merav Michaeli has actually said in interviews in the last few months very, very convincingly, Labour can only come back if we are clear that we have an idea, that we have what she calls social democratic vision. I'm interested to hear if she can actually articulate that vision, but that's, she understands that if that is not there, then Labour won't make a comeback, and we still can't say which party will replace it, because just last election, less than a year ago, Kachol Lavan won so many seats and then has totally evaporated. And in 2006, Kadima came along as the new party which would lead Israel, and it did for one election. It became the only party which was not Labour or Likud to ever form a government in Israel, and that also evaporated after 4 or 5 years. So all these parties which have come along to replace Labour have failed. Labour has failed as well. So we're still waiting to see whether either Labour makes a comeback and becomes once again the alternative to Likud, or if finally we get a new party which will do that. But we haven't yet seen that happening.
Okay, so I got the signal from Crystal that we don't have too much time left for the Q&A, and I insist that we leave enough time for Q&A. So what I want to do is I'll give you a bundle of issues that I have on my mind, and I'll let you decide how to do the time management with what I have on my mind before we go into the Q&A. The one which to me is the most intriguing is the question of the ultra-Orthodox, and again, quoting what you wrote. And you wrote something very strong the other day. And let me quote with your permission. You wrote that COVID-19 is surging again in Israel ultra-Orthodox communities, but no matter how many die, the ultra-Orthodox yeshivas and shuls wouldn't close, because every death is a holy sacrifice for a higher cause. Now, this is a very, very strong statement. And as you said, you already got some ricochets back. Is this a state within a state which will remain a state within a state? So this is point number one, which I would like you to refer to. The other question is, would the Israeli economy and the fact that the standard of living has plummeted in the last few months would have an effect on the results of the elections? And the third minor question, do you see any chance of coalescing between the splinter parties so as to present any challenge to Netanyahu in the forthcoming elections? These are the three elements. You divide, make the time management as you wish.
You tell
and
me.
And then we extend the webinar for another hour.
So first thing, you asked about the ultra-Orthodox. Is this a state within a state? No, it's not a state within a state, because states have to be self-sufficient to a certain degree. And the ultra-Orthodox are not listening they're not abiding by the Israeli law. They're certainly not abiding by the lockdown. They're totally flouting the lockdown. But they need the Israeli state for their welfare, for their security, for their health, for their healthcare. So it's not a state, it's an autonomy. It's an autonomous organization or autonomous entity which thinks that which sets its own rules, but still needs the state for its funding and for most of its material needs. And the real question is not why that is a situation, because that's been a situation for the last 72 years. We talked about Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion gave the ultra-Orthodox community what was called the status quo and basically promised them not to interfere with their lives. And it was okay then because it was a very small community, maybe 2% of Israel. Now it's 12% and it's growing. So, that can't remain the situation. But we've yet to see any party in this election put forward a serious proposal of how to end this situation of the ultra-Orthodox autonomy, the Haredi autonomy, which can't remain as it is, because we're seeing now that 3 times the number of Orthodox people have COVID-19. You know, the situation, it's not fair to blame a community for the pandemic, but certainly the way they've been ignoring the lockdown has contributed in a massive way to the levels of infection. So will this become an issue in the election? I can't say for certain. What we are seeing, we're seeing party leaders who are usually much more careful when talking about the Orthodox because they want maybe to have a coalition with them in the future, beginning to be more critical. So they obviously are getting internal polling showing that the voters are much more angry about this than usual. So this is an issue. The real question is, even if it is an issue in the election, even if it even brings Netanyahu down, because let's remember these parties, the Shas and United Torah Judaism, are Netanyahu's biggest allies. And if the public turns against him and them, then this could really damage him in the election. And this is a scenario where Netanyahu loses the election. Does that mean that after that, the parties which replace Netanyahu, whether it's Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope or Naftali Bennett's Yamina or Yair Lapid Yesh Atid, can they build a coalition without the Orthodox parties, and can they make a serious change? And so far, I'm not seeing any of them with any real proposals for a different kind of social charter in Israel, whereby the Orthodox community are better integrated and cannot live in this autonomy where they ignore the state. But who knows, maybe this is the event which will change that. As for the economy is never the major issue. It was almost never the major issue in Israeli politics. Always security and diplomatic, it used to be the Palestinians, not Palestinians, but security always comes first and the economy always comes only second. So Israeli elections are very rarely decided by economic factors. But this is a COVID election. We've never had a COVID election. Nobody knows what an election will look like in a pandemic, and how differently will people vote. And we can certainly see Netanyahu is very much aware of this, because what is he campaigning on? What is his biggest election promise? I brought the vaccinations to Israel. Israel is being vaccinated the first in the world, and the Israeli economy, the Israeli society will emerge from the pandemic before any other country, and our economy will bounce back before any other country in the world, and it's all thanks to me, and therefore vote for me. He certainly understands that this could well be an economic election, but it could help him, even though Israelis are hurting now, even though hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs and tens of thousands of businesses are on the brink if they haven't yet gone under. It could still work in his favor if people believe that he's the only person who can save Israel from this. But we've already seen that in the polls where he was riding high 7 or 8 months ago, he's gone down quite a bit because of the mishandling of COVID and because of the economic situation. So the real question is whether the vaccinations can save him. But yes, this is very much probably the most economic election we've ever had in Israel, but that's not because of economics, it's because of the pandemic. And your third question about whether the splinter parties will join, we're talking now, it's Wednesday evening in Israel. There are 8 days and a few hours left until the deadline for filing candidates lists to the Central Election Commission. If past history is anything to go by, this last week focuses the minds of the party leaders, and most of the party leaders and most of the parties which are in danger find a way to merge with each other at the last moment. That's what's happened in the past. However, this time we have so many splinters, so many more than usual, and so many egos, and so many people are so angry and so tired of politics that maybe this time we'll have all these splinter parties.
Maybe it's time to raise the threshold again,
or to bring it down. Who knows? But I think that I'm going to go with I'm going to go with what happened in the past. I think that most of the parties will merge in the next 8 days and a bit.
Thank you. I see Crystal here already impatiently looking at us. Crystal, you want to take over?
Yeah, I can relate the questions and let you talk about them. The first one is a broader question from a lecturer at Northwestern. I'm having PTSD here in the US when you speak about the fact that Bibi and others question the results of an election, asking how could it be right if Netanyahu is not declared the winner? That sounds like the situation right now with Donald Trump in the US not accepting the results here and a mob of his followers fomenting insurrection. Do you worry this is beginning of a world trend for authoritarian leaders chipping away at democracy?
Yes, it is very worrying. And we already saw elements of it in the previous three elections. We saw after the first election when Netanyahu made more of his proxies, less himself, but certainly the Netanyahu camp made a whole big deal out of what they alleged were voter fraud in the Arab sector, and that's the first time there was a really serious attempt by a major Israeli political party to doubt the election results. So we saw it then. In the second election, there was this attempt to bring cameras into the polling stations, mainly in Arab areas. So this was certainly both an attempt at doubting the election result and then at voter intimidation. And after the third election, the last election, we also saw Netanyahu basically saying that all the votes which had been cast for the joint list were illegitimate because they were terror supporters. So we certainly have this happening here, as it's happened right now in the US, thankfully unsuccessfully. But yes, it is a global trend that leaders to doubt the result, to cast doubt on the result when they don't like it. We saw it a few months ago in Turkey when Erdogan managed to cancel the results of the Istanbul general election. The Istanbulis voted for a mayor of a rival party to Erdogan's party, so he managed to cancel the election. They had a re-election and he lost it again. This time he did it. This time he accepted it. But yes, this is a global trend. It's a very worrying trend. No question about that.
Thank you. And then the next one related to COVID. Has the high infection rate and high vaccination rate in Israel impact Netanyahu's political standings? Is it enough to actually change his political calculus?
The answer is yes. We saw the first 2 or 3 months of the pandemic when Netanyahu seemed to have things under control. We saw he could go up in the polls. And since I think July, August, where it was clear that his government had failed in its handling of the pandemic, we've seen Likud going down quite significantly by almost 30% of what it was at that peak in May, back in May. So yes, it's impacting on him. And like I said before, this is why his campaign is focusing on vaccinations, because he knows that COVID is the main issue in this election and his handling of COVID. And either he will be seen as the failure who dropped the ball in Israel's war against COVID-19, or he'll be seen as the savior who delivered the vaccinations. But those are the polls between which his campaign is now running.
Thank you. And then we have just a couple more questions, and then we'll do closing remarks. I know that we have 5 minutes to end this. If we go a little bit over, it'll only be by a minute or two. The next question, the big elephant in the room is that Netanyahu appears focused exclusively on preventing his forthcoming trial, which is one of the reasons the government doesn't have an annual budget. Isn't this an example of political malpractice by Netanyahu?
Yes. It's not, it's very, very clear that the budget has become the hostage, not just the budget, so many other things in Israel's governance, but the budget, the annual state budget has become a hostage to Israel, to Netanyahu's political and personal fortunes. And I think malpractice is a mild word to use for that. I can think of so many more harsh words to use in malpractice.
And then the last question we have here, but we have maybe some more questions coming in. Is there a possibility that the anti-Bibi right-wing parties can take down Netanyahu? What alternative government will they offer? And I think you touched on this before.
Well, and I mean, actually, we didn't really talk about that enough because that is a major issue. The biggest challenge to Netanyahu in this election, and this is a historic challenge, for the first time, we're seeing it in the polls. There are more right-wing votes for parties opposed to Likud and Likud's leader Netanyahu than votes for Likud. So if you put the three anti-Netanyahu parties on the right wing, which is Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope, Naftali Bennett's Yamina, and Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Beitenu, they're in the polls. Their total is between 34 to about 38 seats, while Likud, its best showing in the polls the last few weeks has been 31. So there is a major challenge to Netanyahu on the right, and if that challenge stays together, if Bennett and Lieberman and Sa'ar work together after the election and insist on forming a government which is not led by Netanyahu, then Netanyahu will lose. Netanyahu's only hope is for one of those three leaders, Bennett, Lieberman, or Sa'ar, to move back into his camp. But if all three of them stay opposed to Netanyahu, then they will be able to join up with centrist parties like Yesh Atid, like Labour, if Labour survives. Even with Meretz, I wouldn't count that out because Meretz just wants to see Bibi leave. So you could see a coalition all the way from the far right of Israel Beitenu and Yamina to the left of Meretz, getting together after this election to get rid of Netanyahu. That to me is it's a scenario. I wouldn't say it's the likely scenario, but it totally is a scenario which is possible, just so the political system can get rid of Netanyahu and move forward. It'll be a very strange government, like I say, spanning from the far right to the ideological left, but I don't think it's out of the question.
Thanks. And I have one last question for you, and then we can close it up. How do you assess the agreements that Trump and Netanyahu achieved on trade and economic issues? Do you think Biden can build on this progress?
I'm not sure which agreement. Are we talking about the agreement that they achieved between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, or which agreement?
It says on trade and economic issues. I'm not sure. All four.
I'm not aware of a trade agreement between Israel and the US in recent years. So I'm assuming this is a reference to the agreement that that the Trump administration helped Israel achieve with the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco. And I think, like I said, this is a bit of a vindication for Netanyahu because he's one who always argued against the left and against the diplomatic consensus, the international consensus, that Israel needs to first achieve a breakthrough with the Palestinians and solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, and only then the Arab world will accept Israel, and also the wider Arab world will make peace with Israel after the Palestinians. What we've seen here is the paradigm being turned around, and we now have 6 Arab states in a normalization or peace with Israel. Egypt and Jordan already there. Now we have 4 new ones, and all this is happening when Israel has been under Netanyahu, a right-wing government, no concessions to the Palestinians. The diplomatic process with the Palestinians is stuck. This is an anomaly because for so many decades, nobody believed this was possible, and people didn't even think it was desirable. People wanted Israel first to solve their issues with the Palestinians. And Joe Biden and his administration are people who were part of the old consensus on that. Now they're coming back into office, and the situation on the ground has changed. You can't go back to what it was before Israel made peace with the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco, because all of a sudden, all the things that people used to say about the diplomatic process, that Israel needs to go Palestinians first and all the rest of the Arabs later, now have been proven wrong. So we're already seeing the Biden administration kind of accommodating that. They're saying the only thing that they can say, the only good things they have to say about Trump's foreign policy is they say this is good. It's good that Israel made peace with these countries. What this means for the future of the process with the Palestinians, we don't know. We have yet to hear any real details of any plans, if there are plans. There may not be any plans of what this administration wants to do about the Palestinian issue. But like I say, we haven't heard yet. They've only been less than a week in office, so I think we have to give. I think Blinken only began today as Secretary of State, so let's give them a few weeks to come up with the policy.
Elie, you can give the
Yes.
closing remarks. I know that we're 2 minutes.
No, I know, even less than 2 minutes. Okay, so number one, Anshel, I don't know if you noticed, but just 3 minutes ago, we opened a betting booth just outside. And you're the first one to put your bet as to how do you see the results. I mean, you don't have to answer, but if you have a bet, would be interested.
I always make my bet on the last day, and I usually keep it a secret. So
Okay, no,
I'm sorry,
I'm joking.
I'm not going to change that this time.
But if you insist, we will be ready to hear. We will be happy to hear. No, I'm joking.
Call me on March 22.
Okay. We really we covered so many topics and such a big mileage over an hour. I really amazed at all the insights that you shared with us and all the important topics that we covered. And I'm really more than thankful. And I have a sense that we will meet again. I don't know whether before the election or after election or after which election, which is also a good point to be raised. And I would also like to thank our participants and guests who came. And what should I tell you? I really hope we will not find ourselves in this place in a little while and adding another layer to the statistics which I had began with. So thank you very much, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and good luck to us all. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.